The immorality of politics, or the politics of immorality. The Immorality of Politics, or the Politics of Immorality, by Leon Qafzezi. In these 20 years of protracted and tedious transition for the Albanian people, the most obvious feature has been the immorality of Albanian politics. This is already noticeable even from the eye of an ordinary citizen. You do not need to be an analyst or a political scientist. The lack of principles and the non-implementation of the constitutional legality have become quite visible in the eyes of the people. Albanian life also clearly lacks the essential connection of the government with civil society, even when it comes to the country's cardinal problems. Civil society for the government is something ephemeral, a desert mirage. Why does this phenomenon of intentional ignorance occur, one would rightly ask. Civil society carries in itself the objectivity and conscience of the country's intellectuals, which is the national asset for Western European countries. While in Albania this intelligence does not like the ruling state, because it usually does not make pragmatic compromises to the detriment of the country's interests. Precisely for this purpose, politicians stay away from this society like the devil from incense, wanting to turn it into a passive spectator, silent, possibly dumb. Instead of taking advantage of the experience of this society that is the breath of the country. This pressure also happens from time to time with the opposition mass media, which is prevented from telling the truth when the sublime interests of the country demand it. Examples of this pressure have shown the weakness of the state that claims to be democratic and aims to enter Europe, ignoring the objective focus of civil society. The lack of transparency on the part of former majority politicians does not bring anything positive to the country and to themselves. Their arbitrary decisions without consulting civil society on real and important problems for the whole people have been and will be simply pragmatic, for small, petty interests, and as such turned out to be short-term destined. They resemble the legend of Rosafa Castle. In these 20 years of post-communist transition, this political myopia had to be overcome. The irony of the immorality of Albanian politics finds itself pragmatizing in such calls in the political campaigns of the parties: human dimension, sanctity of free vote, freedoms and human rights, sanctity of property, tolerance, zero to corruption and crime. All these objections, today after 2 decades after the throwing of the dictators' busts, make you cry and laugh because they have clearly taken on the paint color of a facade that is becoming more and more incredible and ridiculous in the eyes of the civil community, but also of the Western world. Even an ordinary citizen realizes that there is a deviation from the immutable principles: democracy, human rights and quality of life. An old staging, a deviation, is clearly visible from the ideals of December 90. A former politician wrote in a very late newspaper, after Ramiz Alia's death, saying a distorted truth: Ramiz Alia's spies went out of control and became Democrats. And Alexander Mexi says, the student movement of December was misused by the spies. It seems that this man has forgotten that he was the first Democratic Prime Minister of the country to come out of the movement of December 90. Where were you, former Prime Minister, when the spies abused democracy? Did you sleep or were you on a road abroad, definitely to introduce Albania in Europe? What did you do in these 20 years of democracy, with the famous and sensational law of lustration? Nothing. You used it to buy the silence of political opponents. Unfortunately, this political class takes the people and the civil society for granted. Democratic stability has been one of the weakest, as politics only generated crises, reforms started but did not stop, remained on the road and would need towing by monitoring organizations in Albania such as OSCE or ODIHR to take a few more steps further, because again a new stalemate of reforms. Democratic consolidation has unfortunately been severely damaged. Laws are enforced only when the people err and do not work when the politician errs or is to blame. He hides behind parliamentary immunity. Powers in the Constitution appear divided, while in reality they are centralized as once in the hands of a man who holds the post of Prime Minister of the country. The lack of this independence of powers breeds in itself corruption, which from galloping has now become chronic and, having little hope to disappear from Albanian life, has been fought with circumstantial demagogic means. The laws in the Albanian constitution are a part borrowed from the countries of Western Europe, but very little adapted to the real conditions of our country. Surprisingly, corruption begins when ordinances are superimposed on laws, after ordinances which do not really replace the law but distort it for pragmatic reasons of the rulers. More popularly adapt it to their narrow personal interests. A DCM is enough and the law forgets its face of his original, which appears face to face in the pages of the Constitution. These DCMs, made in a hurry, are not recognized even by the Parliament itself, let alone the ordinary citizen. He just feels the consequences of these endless ordinances at the expense of his economy. This is an injustice not only immoral, but it becomes the source of the birth of corruption, so it is distributed in geometric proportion as it flows down the river of Albanian life, infecting every cell of it. That is why the wrong popular expression is often heard: there is no state. Joe, there is a state, but he works for himself, not for the ordinary citizen. Although he justifies these DCMs as modern feeds, imposed by time, the world, in fact this is a higher eyes to those who have it at the expense. So are the people. Very evident is a very negative factor and with serious consequences for the future of the country. Silent annihilation of the middle class and its replacement with an oligarchic stratum. So a two-polarization is rapidly being created. Rich and poor, forgetting the determinant value